About 21 years ago, two men sat down around the kitchen table in Brooklyn to discuss their alcoholic problem. One of those men is here this evening. I don't know his credo. I know that he has a very Catholic personality, a very sensitive, gentle person. But I think perhaps his credo might be epitomized in the words of an obscure English philosopher who said, "If every man would mend a man, then all the world be mended." It is with heartfelt gratitude that Manhattan welcomes back the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson.
Again, dear friends, 1,000 thanks to you, each and every one. Nothing so much stirs Lois and me as this traditional meeting of the Manhattan group at Christmas time. And it seemed to us that this particular occasion ought to be something for a special celebration. Already the history of AA is being lost in the midst of its 21 years of antiquity. I ventured that very few people here could recount in any consecutive way the steps on the road that led from the kitchen table, Charlie just remarked, to where we are tonight in this Manhattan group. It is especially fitting, too, I think, that we recount or reenact the history. Lois and I'm going to ask you to help. Because at St. Louis, this summer, a great event occurred. This society declared that it had come of age, and it took full possession of its legacies of recovery, unity, and service. It marked the time when Lois and I, being parents of a family now become responsible, declared you to be of age and on your own. Then, too, this is the Christmas season, in which we celebrate the greatest birth and beginning of all. Now let's start on our story, our birth and small beginning, which led here. And let me bounce quickly from spot to spot where this group gathered and tell you a little bit of what happened at each location. First of all, of course, there was a kitchen table, which stood in the brownstone house, which still bears the number 182 Kent Street, Brooklyn. There, Lois saw me go into the depths. From there, I went to Towns Hospital for the last time. There, over the kitchen table, Ebby, one alcoholic talking to another, brought me these simple principles now enshrined in our 12 steps. In those days, there were but 6 steps. We then admitted we couldn't run our own lives. We got honest with ourselves. We made a self-survey. We made restitution to the people we had harmed. We tried to carry this story one to the next. And we asked God to help us do those things. That was the essence of the message over the kitchen table. In those days, we were associated with the Oxford group. One of their founders was Sam Shoemaker, and you have just left Calvary House to come over to these larger quarters, I understand. But our debt to those people is simply immense. We might have found these principles elsewhere, but they did give them to us. And I want to again record our undying gratitude. We also learned from them, so far as alcoholics are concerned, what not to do. Something equally important. A great Jesuit friend of ours, Ed Dowling, once said to me, that, Bill, it isn't what you people put into AA that makes it so good, it's what you left out. So we got both sets of notions from our good Oxford group friends. And it was through them that Ebby had sobered up and became my sponsor, the carrier of this message to me. So we began to go to Oxford group meetings right over in Calvary House, where you've just been gathering. And it was there, fresh out of town hospital, that I made my first pitch, telling about my strange experience, which did not impress the alcoholic who was listening. But something else did impress him. When I began to talk about the nature of this sickness, of this malady, he pricked up his ears. He was a professor of chemistry, an agnostic. And he came up and talked afterward. And soon he was invited over to Clinton Street, our very first customer. We worked very hard with Freddie for 3 years, but alas, he remained drunk for 11 years afterwards. Other people came up to us out of those Oxford group audiences. We began to go down to Calvary Mission, an adjunct of the church in those days. And there we found a bountiful supply of real tough nuts to crack. And soon we began to invite them to Clinton Street. And at this point, the groupers felt that we were overdoing the drunk business. It seemed they had the idea of saving the world, and besides, they'd had a bad time with us. Sam and his associates, he now laughingly tells me, were very much put out. They had gathered a big batch of them in Calvary House, hoping for the miracle. They'd put them upstairs in those nice apartments and had completely surrounded them with sweetness and light. But they soon imported a flock of bottles, and one of them pitched a shoe out the apartment window and right through one of those nice stained glass affairs at the church. So the drunks weren't exactly popular when the Wilsons showed up. At any rate, we began to be with alcoholics all the time, but nothing happened for 6 months. And like the groupers, we brought them to the house. We nursed them. In fact, over in Clinton Street, we developed in the next 2 or 3 years something like a boiler factory, a sort of a clinic, a hospital, and a free boarding house, from which practically no one issued sober. But we had a pile of experience. We began to learn the game. And after our withdrawal from the Oxford group, a year and a half from the time I sobered in 34, we began to hold meetings of the few outside the house who had sobered up. And I suppose that was really the first AA meeting. The book hadn't yet been written. We didn't even call it Alcoholics Anonymous. People asked who we were, and we said, well, we're a nameless bunch of alcoholics. And I suppose the use of that word nameless sort of led to the idea of anonymity, which was later clapped on the book at the time it was titled. Well, there were great doings in Clinton Street. I remember those meetings down in the parlor so well. Our eager discussion, our hope, our fear. And our fears were very great. When anyone in those days had been sober a few months and slipped, it was a terrific calamity. I'll never forget the day, a year and a half after he came to stay with us, that Ebby fell over. And we all said, well, perhaps this is going to happen to all of us. And then we began to ask ourselves why it was. And some of us pushed on. At Clinton Street, I did most of the talking, but Lois did most of the work and of the cooking and of the loving of those early folks. Oh my, the episodes that there were. I was away once on a business trip. I briefly got back to business. One of them was sleeping on the lounge in the parlor. She woke up in the middle of the night hearing a great commotion. He'd got a bottle. He'd also got into the kitchen and had drunk a bottle of maple syrup. And this caused great confusion. And he had fallen naked into the coal hod. And when Lois opened the door, he asked for a towel to cover up his nakedness. On another occasion, she led this same gentleman through the street late at night looking for a doctor, and not finding a doctor, then for a drink, because, as he said, he could not fly on one wing. On another occasion, a pair of them were drunk. We had 5, and on one occasion they were all drunk at the same time. There was a time when 2 of them began to belabor each other with hunks of 2-by-4 down in the basement. And then poor Abby, after repeated trials and failures, was finally locked out one night. But lo and behold, he appeared anyway because he had come through the coal chute and up the stairs, very much begrimed. So you see, Clinton Street, in a sense, was our little church. It was a kind of a blacksmith shop in which we were hammering away at these principles. It was a hospital and a free boarding house. And, of course, for Lois and me, all roads lead back to Clinton Street. And that's particularly true of this group. It was in 1937, while we were still there, that we got an idea that to spread AA, we would have to have some sort of literature, guide rails for it to run on so it couldn't get garbled. We were still toying with the idea that we had to have paid workers who would be sent to other communities. We thought we'd have to go into the hospital business. And out in Akron, where we started the first group, they had a meeting and nominated me to come to New York and do all these things. Well, we were still living at Clinton Street, and while we were there, we solicited Mr. Rockefeller and some of his friends who gave us their friendship, but luckily not much of their money. They gave Smithy and me a little boost during the year of 1938, and that was all. They forced us to stand on our own. And in 1938, Clinton Street saw the beginning of the preparation of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The early chapters of that were written, I should think about May 1938. Then we tried to raise money to get the thing published. And we actually sold stock to the local drunks in this book not yet written, which is an all-time high for promotion. Clinton Street also saw on its second floor in the bedroom the writing of the 12 steps. We had got to chapter 5 in the book, and it looked like we would have to say at some point what the book was all about. So I remember lying there on the bed one night, and I was in one of my typical depressive snits, and I had an imaginary ulcer attack, and the drunks who were supposed to be contributing so that we could eat while the book was being written were slow on the contributions. You've heard the story since. And I was in a damn bad frame of mind. And I laid there with a pad and a pencil, and I began to think over these 6 steps that I've just recited to you. And said I to myself, well, if we put down these 6 steps, the chunks are too big. They'll have to digest too much all at once. Besides, they can wiggle out from in between. And if we're going to do a book, we ought to break those up into smaller pieces. So I began to write, and in about a half an hour, I think, I had busted them up into smaller pieces, and then I was rather pleasantly surprised that when numbered, they added up to 12. Well, that's significant, very nice. And at this point, a couple of drunks sailed in, and I showed them the proposed 12 steps, and I caught fits. Why did we need 12 when 6 were doing fine? And what did I mean by dragging God from the bottom of the list up to the top? And meanwhile, these meetings in the front parlor had largely turned into hassles over the chapters of the book. The roughs were submitted and read at every meeting, so that when the 12 steps were proposed, there was a still greater hassle. And because I'd had this very sudden experience and was on the pious side, I'd larded these steps very heavily with the word God. And other people began to say, well, this won't do at all. The reader at a distance is just going to get scared off. And what about agnostic folks like us? And there was another terrific hassle, which resulted in this terrific 10-strike we have called God as You Understand Him, the higher power, making the hook big enough so that the whole world of the alcoholic can walk through it. So actually, those people who supposed that the elders of AA were going around in white robes surrounded by a blue light full of virtue are quite mistaken. I merely became the umpire of the immense amount of hassling that went into the preparation of the AA book. And that took place at Clinton Street. Well, of course, the book was just the summit of all our hopes at the time. Along with the hassling, there was an immense enthusiasm. And we tried to vision distant readers picking it up and perhaps writing in, perhaps getting sober. Could they do it on the book? All of those things we speculated on very happily. And finally, in the spring of 1939, the book was ready. We'd made a pre-publication copy of it. It had got by the Catholic Committee on Publications. We'd shown it to all sorts of people. We had made the corrections. We had 5,000 copies printed, thinking that would be just a mere trifle, that the book would soon be selling millions of copies. Well, we were very enthusiastic, us promoters. The Reader's Digest had promised to print a piece about the book, and we just saw those books going out in parallel. Nothing of the sort happened. The Digest turned us down flat. The drunks had thrown their money into all this. There were hardly 100 members in all AA, Akron, Cleveland, New York City, and a sprinkling down around Washington and Philadelphia. And here the thing had utterly collapsed. At this juncture, the first meeting of the Manhattan group, which really took place in Brooklyn, stopped. And it stopped for a very good reason. That was that the landlord set Lois and me out into the street, and we didn't even have money to move our stuff into storage. Even that and the moving van, that was done on the cuff. Well, it was then the spring of 1939, and temporarily the Manhattan group moved to Jersey. Hadn't got to Manhattan yet. A great friend, Horace Crystal, let Lois and me have a camp belonging to himself and his mother out at Green Pond. My partner in the book enterprise, old Hank Parker, now gone, lived at Upper Montclair. And we used to come down to 75 William Street, where we had the little office in which a good deal of the book was done, actually. And Sundays, we'd come down to the Parker's house, where we had meetings, which a few old-timers, just a handful now over in Jersey, can remember. And someone lent us a car, and they began passing the hat, and the Alcoholic Foundation, still completely empty of money, did have one small account called the Lois B. Wilson Improvement Fund. And this improvement fund was fortified every month by a passing of the hat, so that we had the summer camp, we had $50 a month, and someone else lent us a car to try to revive the book Alcoholics Anonymous and the flagging movement. So that summer, meetings were held at Hank's house in Upper Montclair. I think then, for the first time, the Manhattan group moved to Manhattan. And in the fall of that year, when it got cold up there at the summer camp, we moved down to Bob Valentine. He and Mag, many of you know, old-timers over in Jersey. And we were close by Rockland Asylum. Bob and I and others went in there, and we started the first institutional group. And several wonderful characters were pried out of there. I hope old Tom Mulhall is here tonight. Tom came over to the Valentines, where he holed up with Lois and me, then put in a room called Siberia because it was so cold. And we bought a coal stove for $4 and kept ourselves warm there during the winter. So did old Tom, and so did a wonderful alcoholic by the name of Jimmy. He never made good. Jimmy was of the devious type. And one of our first remarkable experiences with Jimmy was this. When we moved from Green Pond, we brought Marty with us, who had been visiting, and she suddenly developed terrible pains in her stomach. And this gentleman, Jimmy, called himself a doctor. In fact, he had persuaded the authorities at Rockland that he was a wonderful physician. They gave him full access to the place. He had keys. In fact, he had keys to all the surgical instruments. Incidentally, I think he had keys to the pill closets over there. Marty was suffering awful agonies. And he said, well, there's nothing to it, my dear. You've got gallstones. So he goes over to Rockland. He gets himself some kind of a fishing gadget that you put down their gullets to fish around in there. And he fishes around and yanks up a flock of gallstones, and she hasn't had a bit of trouble since. And, dear people, it was only years later that we learned that the guy wasn't a doctor at all. Meanwhile, though, the folks over here started a meeting in Bert Taylor's tailor shop. Good old Bert is the guy who hocked his then failing business to save the book Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939. In the fall, he still had the shop, and we began to hold meetings there. And little by little, things began to grow. I think we went from there to a room up in Steinway Hall. And we felt that we were in very classical and good company, and that gave us a sort of an aura of respectability, as I remember. And then finally, some of the boys, notably Bert and Horace, said, well, AA should have a home. We really ought to have a club. And so the old 24th Street Club, which had belonged to the Artists and Illustrators, and before that was a barn going back to Revolutionary time, was taken over. I think Bert and Horace signed the first lease. They soon incorporated it, though, lest somebody slip on a banana peel outside. And Lois and I, who had moved from the Valentines to live with another AA, then deciding we wanted a home for ourselves to a single furnished room down in a basement on Barrow Street in Greenwich Village. I remember Lois and I going through Grand Central, wondering where we'd light next, just before the Greenwich Village move. We were very tired that day, and we walked off the main floor there and sat on one of those gorgeous marble stairways leading up to the balcony. And we both began to cry and say, well, where will we ever light? Will we ever have a home? Well, we had one for a while in Barrow Street, and when the club was opened up, we moved into one of those rooms there. Tom Mulhall came over from the Valentines, and right then and there, a tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous was generated. It seemed that volunteers had been sweeping out the club. It seemed that many of the alcoholics had keys to the club, and they came and went, and sometimes they stayed, and sometimes they got drunk and acted very badly, and doing we know not what, and there had to be somebody there to really look at. So we thought we'd approach old Tom, who had a pension as fireman. So we approached old Tom and we said, well, Tom, how would you like to come and live at the club? Tom says, what's on your mind? Well, we said, Tom, we really need somebody here all the time, to make the coffee and see that the place is heated and throw some coal on that furnace over there and lead the drunks outside if they're too bad. Well, Tom says, ain't you going to pay me? Oh, no, he said, this is Alcoholics Anonymous. We can't have any profession. Well, Tom says, I do my 12-step work. I don't charge them nothing. He says, but what you guys want is a janitor, and if you're going to get me, you're going to pay, see? Well, we were very much disturbed about this development. In fact, Lois and I were disturbed about our own situation. We weren't being exactly paid. They were just passing the hat for us, you understand? In fact, I think that we went for 7 years of the history of this society with an average income of $1,700 a year, which for a former stockbroker is not too big. So this question of who was a professional and who wasn't bore very heavily at the time on Tom and me, and Tom began to get it settled. He began to show that if a special service was asked for anybody full-time, that we'd have to pay or not get it. So finally, we haggled Tom down on the theory that he already had a pension, and he came to live there. So Tom and Lois and I lived there, and meetings began in that old club. Well, that club saw many a terrific development. And from that club sprang all the groups in this area. The club saw the passage of the Rockefeller dinner when we thought we'd all be rich as a movement, and Mr. Rockefeller saved us by not giving us money. That club saw the Saturday Post article published. In fact, the Post at that time said no pictures, no article. So if you will look up the March 1st, 1941 issue of the Saturday Post, you will see a picture of the interior of the club and a flock of us sitting before the fire. They didn't use our names, but they insisted on pictures. Anonymity wasn't then quite what it is today. And with the advent of that peace, there was a prodigious rush of inquiry, about 6,000 of them. By this time, we'd moved the little office from Newark, New Jersey, over to Vesey Street, where you will find in the old edition of the book, Box 658, Church Street Annex. And that was the box into which the first inquiries come. We picked out that location because Lois and I were drifters, and we picked it because it was the center of the geographical area here. And we didn't know whether we'd light in Long Island, New Jersey, or Westchester. So the first AA post office box was down there with a little office alongside of it. Well, the volunteers couldn't cope with this tremendous flock of inquiries. Heartbreakers, with 6,000 of them. We simply had to hire some help. And at that point, we asked you people if you'd send the foundation $1 apiece a year, so we wouldn't have to throw that stuff in the wastebasket. And that was the beginning of the foundation and the service office and the book company. That club saw all those things transpire. But there was a beginning in that club at that time that none of us noticed very much. It was just the germ of an idea. It often looked in after years as though it might die out. Yet within the last 3 years, it has become what I think is one of the greatest developments that we shall ever know. And here I'm going to break into my little tale to introduce my partner in all this, who stayed with me when things were bad and when things have been good. And she'll tell you what began upstairs in that club and what has eventuated from it, Lord.
Good evening, everybody. First, though, I do want to thank you all so very, very much for your wonderful gift and for your continued gifts year in and year out. As Bill said, it is one of the thrilling experiences of our life, of our yearly life, is this meeting down here at the Manhattan Group. And it always does seem like coming home when we come down here. We thank you all so very much. When Bill started off, he mentioned St. Louis and what the big meeting out there, big convention there this year meant. But it meant a tremendous thing also for something I've been particularly interested in, is the family groups. Because that was really the very first place, first time that the family group meetings went right alongside with the AA meetings, and they were really, we'll say, recognized by AAs as belonging. And it was a culmination of really a long-time dream. And I was telling about 24th Street, that was just something very, very dreamlike back in those days. But the wives of the alcoholics knew that they wanted something and needed something themselves. They went to the AA meetings and they were just thrilling and inspiring and just wonderful. But they needed something specific for themselves. And we used to meet upstairs while the alcoholics were downstairs. We wives used to meet upstairs and try to figure out how to help each other. We used to tell each other's stories, tell our stories to each other. But we didn't really know enough about ourselves, and we didn't know what was the matter with ourselves, and we didn't know really what we needed or how to go about it. And so the little group that we had there didn't really amount to much except as just an idea. But that wasn't the only place that the wives and husbands of alcoholics and families, mothers and children and fathers really felt that they needed something for themselves. Because all over the country, we families have had the same idea. And it's really been an awfully interesting thing. I should think the psychiatrists would be awfully interested in it, or the sociologists and all kinds of people, because it was a universal need that started these family groups all over the country. And it's another very interesting thing, I think, also, that here in New York, perhaps, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of this group here, we'll say, have never heard of a family group. Maybe that's true, I don't know. But every place except the centers of AA, I mean, where AA really started, in Akron and Cleveland and New York, they are the very slowest to catch on to the family group idea nowadays. The family groups are growing like mad all over the world. And we have, I don't know how many there are now. I haven't caught up with the last number. But there are more than 800 family groups. And I was down at our office. We have a central office that we call a clearinghouse, a central service, just as the foundation that used to be called the Central Service of AA is here in New York, so is our central service, the family groups. And I was down there today, and by the way, it completes the circle in one respect. It's at the old 24th Street Club, just where the idea really first started, that we have our offices. I was down there today, and a group came in, an inquiry about how to start a group in Indonesia. We have groups in New Zealand, in Australia, in Africa, South Africa, Germany, England, Ireland. I can't tell you all of them, but I sent 40 Christmas cards to the foreign groups. So we have 40 foreign groups, to say nothing of the groups in Canada, which of course really belong to, we're all one family here in America. But the growth has been just tremendous. In the last 3 years particularly, we've had this little clearinghouse or central service office for about 5 years. And the way that started was that in 1950, Bill traveled around the country to try and get the conference started. And at that time, he ran across so many family groups, and they were so wonderful and so thrilling that he thought they ought to have some sort of a central service, just the way the AAs did. And he asked me if I would try and set up such a thing. And I'm going to be frank with you that I was having such fun digging in my garden and playing around our house up in Bedford Hills that at first I didn't, although I loved the family group idea and the working with other wives, yet I didn't want to take the responsibility. But I was persuaded to, but I'm so glad. It's been the most gratifying thing that has ever happened to me, I think, except Bill's sobriety in AA. It's really been a perfectly thrilling experience. And I guess that's all I can tell you tonight about it. But I do hope that New York, like the rest of the country, will finally become conscious that there is such a thing as a family group. Thank you very much.
So you see, it was in the confines of the Manhattan group of those very early days that this germ of an idea came to life. Lois might have added that since the St. Louis conference, one new family group has started every single day of the week since someplace in the world. I think the deeper meaning of all this is that AA is something more than a quest for sobriety, because we cannot have sobriety unless we solve the problem of life, which is essentially the problem of living and working together. And the family groups are filling this enormous twist that has been put on our domestic relations by our drinking. I think it's one of the greatest things that's happened in the year. Well, let's cut back again to Old 24th Street. One more thing happened there. A tradition was generated, I guess. It had to do with money. You notice how slow I was on coming up with that dollar bill tonight? Well, I suppose I was thinking back, some sort of an unconscious reflex. But even then, we had a deuce of a time getting that club supported, just passing the hat. No fees, no dues, just the way it should be. But the no fee and due business was construed into no money at all. Let George do it. And I remember I'd been on this particular day down to the foundation office, and we just put out this $1 a year measuring stick for the alcoholics to send us some money if they felt like it, and not too many were feeling like it. And I remember that I was walking up and down the office there, damning these drunks. That evening, still feeling real sore about the stinginess of the drunks, I sat on the stairs there at the old 24th Street club talking to some would-be convert, and Tom Burrell was leading the meeting that night, and at the intermission, he put on a real plug for money, the first one that I'd ever heard. At that time, money and spirituality couldn't mix even in the hat. I mean, you mustn't talk about money. Very reluctantly, we had gone into the subject with Mulhall and the landlord, but, well, passing the hat, you just passed it, but we were behind in the rent. And Tom put on a heavy pitch, and I went on talking to my prospect. And the hat came up the stairs, even as it came up on the stage. And as it came along, I fished in my pocket and I pulled out a $50. Well, that very day, too, I think Abby had come in the office, a little worse for wear. And with a very big heart, I'd handed him $5. Our total income at the time was $30 a week, which had come out of the Rockefeller dinner affair. So I'd given $5 of the 30 and felt very generous, see. But now comes the hat to pay for the light, heat, and so forth, rent. And I pull out this $50 and I look absently minded at it, and I put my hand in the other pocket and pulled out a dime and put it in the hat. So I have never railed at alcoholics for not getting up the money since. But there, you see, was the beginning of the AA tradition. Things that had to do with professionalism, with money. But following 1941, this thing just mushroomed everywhere. Groups began to break off out into the suburbs, but a lot of us still wanted a club, and the 24th Street Club just wouldn't do the trick. So we got an offer from Norman Vincent Peale to take over a church at 41st. In fact, it had deteriorated very sadly. It was said to be a rather sinful neighborhood, if you gather what I mean. And the last young preacher that Peale had sent there seemed very much against the drinking and smoking and other even more popular forms of sin, so therefore he had no parishioners. And here was this tremendous church, and all that we could see was a bigger and bigger club here in New York City. So we moved in, and the body of the church would hold 1,000 people, and we had a hall upstairs that would hold another 800, and we visioned this as soon full, and then there were bowling alleys downstairs, and we figured that the drunks would soon be getting a lot of exercise, and after they warmed up down there, they could go upstairs in the gymnasium, and then we had cooking apparatus for a restaurant, and this was to be our home, and we moved in. Well, sure enough, the place filled up just like mad. Well, then questions of administration, questions of morals, questions of meetings, questions of which was the Manhattan group and which was the club and which was the intergroup. The secretary of the club was also the intergroup secretary. Began to get this seething mass into a terrific tangle, and we learned a whole lot about clubs there. And whilst all this was going on, the AA groups were spreading all throughout America and to foreign shores, and each group, like our own, was having its terrific headaches. And in that violent period, nobody could say whether this thing would hang together or not. Would it simply explode and fly all to pieces? And on thousands of anvils of experience, of which the Manhattan group was certainly one down in that 41st Street Club, more sparks came off that anvil than any I ever saw. We hammered out the tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was first published in 1945. We hammered out the rudiments of an intergroup, which now has become one of the best there is anywhere, right here in New York. And finally, however, the club got so big that it bust. The intergroup moved out. So did the Manhattan group, with $5,000, which was its part of the take, which it hung on to like this. And from the Manhattan group's experience, we learned that although the foundation needs a reserve, for God's sake, don't have any money in a group treasury, because the hassles about that $5,000 lasted until they got rid of it somehow. I've forgotten just how. And then you all moved down to dear old Sam Shoemaker's Calvary, the very place of our beginnings. And now we've made another move. And so we grow. And such has been the road that leads back to the kitchen table at Clinton Street. So, dear friends, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas indeed.
Thank you, Lois. Thank you, Mara. And thank you, Bill. I understand that there will be a Christmas party here tomorrow, so as you were on the chairs, will you leave them where they are? Well, those of you who care to, join me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.